The Arizona Society Sons of the American Revolution presents The Old North Church, The Untold Story, narrated by George White, Barry M. Goldwater Chapter. This is Volume 3 of the three-part mini-series. As mentioned in the previous videos, the Boston City Council of 1876 made the decision to hang a plaque or a tablet on the Christ Church, believing it to be the Old North. There are many history books, diaries, church, and city records of Boston, however, that predate 1876 and show the Christ Church and the Old North Church were two different churches several blocks apart from each other. Wouldn't it be great if Paul Revere could tell us in his own words about the events of April 18th, 1775, and more specifically, to which church he sent his friend to show the signals in? Well, actually he did. He wrote an 8-page letter to Jeremy Belknap in 1798, who was the corresponding secretary of the Massachusetts Historical Society, 78 years before the City Council hung the plaque or the tablet. The Massachusetts Historical Society has made the letter available to view, along with a typed version of each page. On page 2 of the letter he says, "I agreed with a Colonel Conant and some other gentlemen that if the British went out by water, we would show 2 lanterns in the North Church steeple." Recall from the previous videos, the first and second churches in Boston were called the South Church and North Church, respectively. Paul's house was across the square from the North Church, and he was married there. He couldn't have been any more clear about the name of the church. And that brings us to our first book, The Historical Account of Christ Church, Boston, published in 1824, as mentioned in the first video, for the 100th year anniversary of the Christ Church. The book covers many details about the Christ Church, including the height of the tower, the dimensions of the building, and even how thick the walls are. But the words North Church or Old North Church are never used, not one time. It is always called the Christ Church in this book. Some people who are also not mentioned in this book include Paul Revere, William Dawes, and even Robert Newman, who was said to have hung the lanterns. The entire event of the lanterns is also not mentioned. Then in 1861, Longfellow's poem of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride is published. As can be seen from the pages of the book, Longfellow uses the titles North Church once and Old North Church twice. Both titles were correct, but ironic that Longfellow used the title Old North Church, unless he had been doing some research or talking to some of the older residents of Boston. Recall in Paul Revere's letter, he never uses the title Old North Church, and he says the title North Church only one time. Now, if you have not read Paul Revere's Ride, then you may not be aware that Longfellow had some historical facts written incorrectly. In the poem, Longfellow says Paul Revere was waiting across the river, waiting for the signal lanterns to be shown in the church tower. In Paul Revere's letter, Paul says he called upon a friend to send the signals, and then he went home to change. The lanterns were not intended for Paul to see. They were a backup plan in case he didn't make it across the river. Now fast forward to just 2 years before the City Council creates the tablet. The Christ Church publishes its book celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Christ Church. Only now it appears that some history has been added to the evening of April 18th, 1775, that did not appear 50 years prior. Robert Newman's name now appears in the history, and it says that Paul Revere was across the river waiting for Newman to send him the signal. To emphasize the story, they added inserts of Longfellow's poem along with the telling of Newman's story, assuming the Longfellow poem was factually correct. The obvious addition to the church history, the historical account of the Christ Church got the story completely wrong, and it conflicts with Paul Revere's own words. It appears that this part of the church history was added after the children's poem became popular and not based on any recorded facts. The added text seems to paint Robert Newman as the hero of the evening. Page 25 reads, "If Robert Newman's courage or patience or firmness of self-control had failed him for an instant, Paul Revere would have looked in vain across the dark waters at the steeple." How could the historical account of the Christ Church get their own story wrong? What is the source of the newly added history, and how did Newman's name get added along with the words Old North Church? The answer to that, we have to read the authorities page, and there we find the account of Mr. Newman's story was given to the writer by Mr. Newman's son. The only source that connects Paul Revere's ride to the Christ Church is the son of Robert Newman. No other facts are presented, while there are many facts that contradict it, including this book, the historical account of the Christ Church. Besides local lore or stature or bragging rights, what motivation would Robert Newman's son have for creating this story? A possible answer to that can be found in this next book, Society of Colonial Wars in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. On page 99, we learn that on the evening of April 18, 1875, Robert Newman's son, Samuel Newman, has reenacted the displaying of the lanterns in the Belfry Tower as the closing of the church services of that evening for the centennial celebration. The same centennial celebration for why the Boston City Council created the tablet to hang on the church. The book Bunker Hill by Nathaniel Philbrook was recently brought to my attention by fellow compatriot Mark Seifert. This book has an interesting map in it of 1774 with an update from Jeffrey L. Ward that shows the locations of Dr. Joseph Warren's house, the Green Dragon Tavern, the Old North Church, and the Christ Church. Using this map, let's take a closer look at Paul Revere's letter. At 10 o'clock, he is summoned to meet Dr. Warren. At 11 o'clock, he is about to set off on a very good horse to begin his ride. He has 1 hour. We know from Paul Revere's letter he went to Dr. Warren's house, and looking at the scale on the map, it looks to be about a half a mile away from his house. His round trip on foot would likely be about 20 or 25 minutes because he couldn't just run down the street. He had to do this without being seen by the posted guards. Using the map, we can see a possible route Paul may have taken, and this assumes he was already dressed and left immediately for Dr. Warren's home. We know from the letter he left Dr. Warren's home and called upon a friend to make the signals. It would be logical to believe the friend he called upon lived on the way back to Paul Revere's own home or nearby, because in the letter he says he then went home to change into his boots and coat. Notice Robert Newman's home is north of Paul Revere's home and near the Christ Church. Robert Newman's home also has British troops being quartered there, as does the Christ Church. Why would Paul Revere walk all the way north to Newman's home, risk getting caught, knowing the home and the Christ Church are quartering troops, and then walk all the way back to his own house, and then all the way back north again to row across the river? It would have made more sense for Paul to stop at his own house first and then go to Newman's house, if Newman really was the person he called upon. Remember, Paul's time frame was only 1 hour, and he still had to get to his boat, row across the river, and get a horse. He wouldn't have had time to go to Newman's home before going to his own. Additionally, Newman's story again doesn't match, as he says a ship's captain summoned him, and Paul says he called upon a friend to send the signal. Let's look at some of the books and records. We can see in this Boston City directory, they have a listing of the churches and ministers, and on the second church entry it reads, Second or Old North Church, and Reverend John Lathrop is listed. 1824 publication of the Christian Examiner, on page 265 we see John Lathrop from Norwich, Connecticut, and at the bottom of the page it reads, Dr. Lathrop was first settled over the Old North Church. Its meeting house was destroyed by the British during the siege of Boston. And speaking of Norwich, Connecticut, this next book is called Old Houses of the Ancient Town of Norwich. And on page 190 we find one of William Lothrop's sons, John Lothrop, became the pastor of the Old North Church in Boston. It appears that even in other New England states, they knew the Old North Church had been destroyed by the British. This next book is from the Rhode Island Historical Society collection. And in this volume, they show recorded in John Calmer's diary. He wrote the second church was called the North Church, and in time the Old North Church. He also notes that during the Revolution, this church lost its meeting house. This Boston guidebook from 1909 points out that at the head of the square on the north side is the site of the Old North Church, which the British destroyed and pulled down during the siege. It also points out that the tablets that were hung on the Christ Church in 1878 are wrong, and the true Old North Church was destroyed. Even the guidebooks for tourists were saying the Christ Church is not the correct church. The Loyalists of Massachusetts and the Other Side of the American Revolution is rather interesting. It tells the story of the Revolution, but from the British or the Loyalist point of view, and looks down upon the Patriots and their accomplishments. It also, however, verifies that Mather Byles Jr. of the Christ Church was a staunch Loyalist, in the writer's words, and that he left the Christ Church and became chaplain for the regiments. Ultimately, he left Boston with the troops and took his family with them. There is also mention of the meeting house in the North Square. Speaking of Mather Byles Jr., his father was the nephew of Cotton Mather, who, recall from the second video, was minister of the Old North Church during the Salem witch trials. In the Boston Weekly Journal of 1728, he wrote the obituary for Cotton Mather, his uncle, and recognized him as the senior pastor of the Old North Church in Boston. Even Mather Byles and Mather Byles Jr. knew the Christ Church was not the Old North Church because they were related to the Mathers family and had always known about both churches. This book, Collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Part 3 of the Belknap Papers, Reverend John Lothrop's wife has passed away. Her death is announced in the Boston Gazette of 1778, and it reads, "Departed of this life, Mrs. Mary Lothrop, the amiable consort of Reverend John Lothrop of this town." The article, like the others, recognizes Mr. Lothrop as the minister of the Old North Church. So who were John and Mary Lothrop? They were both born and raised in Norwich, Connecticut, and they were married in Boston in 1771. Mary was ultimately laid to rest in the Granary Burial Grounds. The burial grounds have tablets on the gates that display the names of just some of the patriots that are buried there. John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and Paul Revere, to name a few. And under ministries, we also see Jeremy Belknap and John Lothrop. Lothrop's wife, Mary, was born Mary Wheatley to Captain John Wheatley from Ireland and his wife, Submit Peck Wheatley. She had four patriot brothers who fought in the Revolution, and unfortunately, John Jr. and Luther both died in the war. One last comment on Mary Wheatley's family. Her parents are both buried in Lebanon, New Hampshire, where Captain John Wheatley was the Justice of the Peace and one of the selectmen of the Committee of Safety, and he was a representative to the Vermont Assembly. The Lebanon, New Hampshire DAR named their chapter after his wife, Submit Wheatley. In the final book of this chapter of this series, in the Library of Congress, there is a book called Genealogy of the Wheatley Family that traces the Wheatley family tree from Ireland all the way forward to American generations in the early 1900s. On page 111 of this book is a listing of my grandfather that I am named after. Captain John Wheatley and Quartermaster Andrew Wheatley are my patriot ancestors. This presentation was brought to you by the Arizona Society, Sons of the American Revolution. Thank you for watching.